This is me, Vishwas Nayan. I'm the host of this podcast, and trust me, Shannon Kuehn was one of my most desired guests on the podcast. And I have that like I have that love for all the developer advocacy team, irrespective of any institution that I'm talking about. Like, let it be a big firm or a small firm. I don't mind whether the culture of that firm is built to a stocks of like $1,000 per stock or something. I don't care about it. I just feel that developer advocacy and DevRel has an impactful role in getting us developers into the right track. And I feel that Shannon Kuehn is doing amazing job in getting right amount of content out for the world, and she has Azure Remix as well on YouTube. Please do go and check it out, because that's one of my favorite thing to watch when I'm burnt out with a lot of other work. So I'm pretty honored that Shannon Kuehn ma'am is already here on my podcast. And it's all about tech. It's all about a journey that defined the moment that we are talking today. Like, by the time we are talking something in the podcast, there is hundreds of tech which is being updated over a course of time. I don't care about it, but now it's all about how do you get that understanding to be that right engineer for all the problem statement for the future world. I'm pretty glad Shannon Kuehn ma'am is here, and thank you so much for being on my podcast. Means a lot.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm glad it finally worked out. I know we're dealing with a very wide gap in terms of your time zone versus mine, so I'm glad it worked out.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's perfect. Your professional journey was something which is supposed to be demystified, because it's twists and turns here and there, but it landed in cloud at the end of the day. And I just wanted to understand, like, what was your journey as a student? Because now you told me before the podcast, you did a lot of certifications, but, of course, there is a mindset as a student that defines us to be the professional tomorrow, right? So I wanted to know, what was your journey as a student, and how did it really influence you to be a professional of what we are desiring to be today? Like Shannon Kuehn, Sarah Lian, and the other dev advocate folks are like, they are the gold standard for us. Like, we want to be like them one day. Sure. So what is it all about?
So when I went to college, I graduated from college with a communication studies degree and an English minor. So nothing related to technology. And I often feel like it's hard to pick what you want to do for the rest of your life at the age of 18, right? Because we're living longer, things change, you change. And I just picked something that was broad enough that could get me in the door somewhere. And as a direct result of me being a DJ and having to figure out how to hook everything up to my computer to record demos, I thought that was kind of fun. And I think if I would have done the traditional computer science at college, I probably would have switched majors, right? Because I feel like I approach things in a very different way, and I made technology fun to myself. And so over the course of, after college, I kind of found myself in a bunch of different roles, doing a lot of different things, but didn't really, fall in love with any one particular thing as it stood, right? I got hired on at a real estate investment firm, and they didn't have anybody internal. They were a small firm that focused on IT. And I was able to kind of do a lot of the basic help desk stuff. And they thought that I was magical and mystical, and they just kept investing in my education. So I had that happen in my late 20s. And so I didn't really become technical until I was like 26, 27. And then fast forward, my entire career has been, focusing heavily on a lot of different technologies. So traditional on-prem, but as we have moved towards cloud, it's been more automation, more PowerShell, more ARM templates, Bicep. So it's an interesting paradigm, right? It's the idea that I'm always kind of trying to evolve, and I'm going towards things that are not what I thought I'd be doing 10, 15 years ago, right? Even when I was in college, if you would have told me I'd be working at Microsoft, actually doing technical work, I don't know if I would have believed you, because at that point, I didn't think I was technical. So.
Yeah, that's true. That journey is so magical. Like, it changes our life. It defines what we are supposed to be doing. Some opportunities, they come and they just make sure that you are something new, like what you were yesterday. Like, that's how they define us. So now I just wanted to get that understanding of what was your first introduction to the room full of people talking DevOps, because they say DevOps this, DevOps that, DevOps has all the solution. But like, what was your first introduction when you entered the room full of people talking DevOps?
Probably was when I was working at a Microsoft partner called 10th Magnitude. Now they wound up getting purchased by Cognizant, so they're part of Cognizant now. But the firm back then was more of a boutique type firm, and that was probably the first time I even got really introduced to the term. Like the term had become a buzz term prior to that job, but I worked with DevOps engineers, and that was probably the first time that I got a huge heaping dose of what it is. That it's not just one thing, right? It's people, process, and technology. And the technology stuff it's hard to get to know all of it, right? But the harder part, I think, is understanding the people in the process, right? Because we've lived in this world that's been very heavily waterfall-esque for so long, and we don't really understand what it's like to transform that and be more agile and quickly, input software defined environments, stand things up, get things configured, et cetera. So it was probably 5, 6 years ago was when I first got the introduction into what DevOps really is. I thought it was like one tool. It's not. I thought it was more tool based, but it's more of a process and kind of a philosophy is probably the better way to word it.
Yeah, that's true, because like sometimes when I think of DevOps is this, DevOps that, we use Spinnaker for this, we use Spinnaker for that. And I'm like, every tool does the same thing. What's so special in Spinnaker or anything? And I was like, okay, it's always that one understanding that the culture is defined there. It's like
Right.
you have that definition of culture, you have the definition of principles, and basically you mint money. So don't forget that. So it's all about that. So, you have been advocating well-architected framework, security, and everything related to the architecture these days, right? But like all the companies and all the flavors of the cloud today, they are having their own well-architected frameworks today. And there is always that one understanding that they really want to throw out to the world. It's still a piece of the hardware connected to a network. Now come
Right.
and use it. So
Right.
what is it all about when we are supposed to be understanding a well-architected framework for anything that we are considering cloud today? Might be hybrid, public, we don't know. So what is it all about today?
So I always think of this as an evolving topic, right? Things are going to continue to evolve and change and shift. I think of it like a cookie cutter approach to take on cloud, right? Because of the fact it's going to be ever so slightly different than if you were managing that infrastructure on premises and your developers were on premises. It's going to be a little bit different. And so it's a way in which to kind of do that prescriptive way of understanding how you stand up environments, how you stand up in, how you think about security, how you think about resiliency, how you think about the networking, right? How do you think about zero trust? Those types of themes show up in the well-architected framework and the cloud adoption framework. They're kind of in both. It's weird. They're related. They're not twins, but they're definitely siblings when you think about, at least in the Microsoft realm. I'm sure it's very similar in the realm of Amazon, and I think Google has their own nowadays. But I think it's the way in which we get a chance to talk to these customers and say, you can actually stand up this environment in this specific way, and it's going to give you this type of result. Now, there's always going to be the opportunity to change whatever you need to change in order to have it match what you're looking to have it, do for your environment, right? But I think of it kind of like a prescriptive way of embracing cloud if you don't have any understanding as to how to stand something up, but you have a definitive need that needs to be met by the cloud.
Yeah, I know, because that professional world is so complex, right? When you go and talk to somebody, they're like, what is wrong with you? It's a new jargon that comes up, like MTTR is fine, but there is even something more. So there's always
Right.
that metrics that we come up with, like, we are now defining an AI system on the cloud. Like back then there was MIT guys and the Stanford guys who used to do that. And
Right.
probably after open sourcing some of the softwares, and I think TensorFlow really changed the way in which we are architecting some open source AI also today. So now Onyx is there from Microsoft itself. So there is an impact of a lot of system architecture that is going on.
Yes.
Like, it's like,
Right.
how can you draw the last drop of the entire compute efficiency there? Like, how can you just drain off all the efficiency? Like, there's a meme about NVIDIA saying that there's a cow and there's an engineer who's coming up for drawing out all the things with deep learning. And I'm like, what? Like, it's how it's growing. So what's an
Right.
AI system according to you? And also, when we speak of an infrastructure, which used to do a same old mundane job of connecting folks through web, because as Scott Anselman says, we have to bet on web. And that is
Yes.
what it's all about. So What is it all about when you think of an AI system that we are building today on the same old infrastructure that is used on the cloud, that is still architected for some accessibility? So what is it all
Sure.
about when we are thinking about AI system today?
Yeah, so if I'm thinking about it, I often think of it in the PaaS realm, meaning it's sort of magical and mystical. There's so much I don't have to worry about, right? If I stand up a specific machine learning workspace, I'm not standing up the servers, patching the servers, dealing with all of that, right? I am going into the portal or I'm building something with the AZCLI or PowerShell or something, right? And it's just being spun up for me. I don't necessarily think of it like I'm managing an environment. I have an environment that it's ready to go for me with minimal effort on my end. So I often think of AI as more magical. Cloud is kind of magical, but I think of AI as kind of one step farther because it's an area that I'm still getting used to. It's an area that I didn't go to school for. And I really, well, I mean, clearly I just said I didn't go to school for anything technology, but it's something I hadn't touched until even Microsoft, right? So understanding algorithms, understanding that, machine learning is a lot of statistical stuff. I don't have to worry about all of the lower level pieces. All I have to worry about is where I'm deploying this, what the algorithm looks like. And I think, in the realm of cloud, the simplification is really key. And so that's where I think of it's kind of like magical, mystical land, like I often think of cloud as being this interesting realm related to AI, because, AI, if you watch movies, that's kind of the way it's presented, right? AI is kind of this sort of weird, interesting power. And it feels that way in the cloud because there's so much less that you have to focus on. You just get to focus on the algorithm, fine tuning the algorithm, and then everything just comes as a result of you focusing on one kind of area. So to me, it's probably the best solution if you were trying to go down in that space. And I often wonder what it's going to be like for folks that are going to go into college, like the generation that's in like, late elementary, junior high, high school, when they start going into college, what's machine learning going to look like and AI going to look like 10 to 15 years from now? So it's interesting. Like, are we just going to have it be, like going to be a computer chip in our brain and we're just going to be able to do whatever we want? I don't know. It's going to be interesting, right?
Yeah, I think we are still waiting for a state of the art cloud service provider. Like we
Right.
just want something which is magical, like click and one click
And it's
rollback,
up and it's
one click.
right.
It's
Right.
always that we are thinking about. So we now have to deal with something called a security, because these days security is emphasized more than what I feel it was emphasized like 2 years before, because security was never considered as one of the matrices in our infrastructure, but today it's the ultimate goal. Like if your infrastructure is secure, like Fannie Mae made an amazing name just by solving some of the vulnerabilities which was raised on the
Sure.
public. Like it was that revolution that is it really defined on that moment. So what is it all about when we talk about an infrastructure security today? Like, are we still waiting something to be arriving in the market, or is what is it all about when we are defining a secure architecture on a cloud infrastructure?
Sure. I think that story is going to continue to evolve, right? So right now it's a shared responsibility model. There's certain sides of that equation which will be the customer's responsibility, certain sides of it that will be the cloud solution provider's responsibility. And I don't think that will change too much. I think there's always going to be the idea that you will maintain your data, your user identities, right? So regardless of what platform you're on, that will always be a part of your world. But we still have a lot of customers that are living in the realm of infrastructure as a service. So you have to think about securing that a little bit differently than you would if you were deploying something that was a platform as a service or a software as a service solution. So, security baselines are important in that regard. You can think about NIST frameworks or ISO, what is it, 1270001? Is it 3 zeros or 2? I can never remember. So it's those types of frameworks that you want to probably use kind of benchmarks for if you're running infrastructure as a service. But your PaaS services, your software as a service environments, the security level is a lot different. So you want to think about multi-factor authentication. You want to think about, if you need to get access to an Azure SQL server, what do you have to do if your developers are on premises and they need access to that in the cloud, right? It just changes the security conversation ever so slightly. And every one of the frameworks we had discussed previously, so the WellArchitected Framework, the Cloud Adoption Framework, there is a section for each one of those that surrounds itself with security. But it's an evolving story though. And I feel like, the evolution is for everybody to sort of ditch infrastructure as a service, which won't happen anytime soon, right? I feel like there will still be VMs before I retire. I feel like folks will still have things on VMs. I think that's still going to be a tried and true sort of platform to put things on, but we want to evolve to get to serverless because it's less of a security constraint, right? You can think about your developers being more agile and building out solutions without having to make sure, is this on a VM? Is the VM secure? Are the disks encrypted, right? Because we have to sort of take ourselves out of the on-prem world and kind of move into infrastructure as a service, that motion has been the most time consuming. But I have seen customers become more agile as they evolve in the cloud, especially if they've been in the cloud for 5 or 6 years, maybe even closer to 10 years. There are some customers that are pretty savvy and they've already been in the cloud for a bit. So as they evolve, they get to this interesting realm where they're not, they lean on the provider to I guess, provide more of the security boundary for them. So I think that's one thing to factor in is if you can figure out a way to sort of break apart the monolith, right? Like that's always the big hard thing to do. We have had these big, huge environments on premises, and we have to sort of break it apart and make it be more of a microservice or more of a serverless environment. And that's not an overnight sensation, unfortunately. It takes some time to get to that point. But I think security is evolving. Security has different focus points related upon what platform that you're moving your environment into. And it's going to be a focus. But the cool thing is, if you don't have a lot of security people in-house, there's a lot of cool tooling that each one of the cloud providers has in order to help you get yourself to a secure environment, right? So you don't have a public IP open that, you can RDP into a server or SSH into a server, right? You can start to think about using some of the baked in native tools that help you make things even more secure. When I was customer focused, I used to work with a lot of firms that believed they were secure. And then we would do this whole, like, what do you have? Let's take an assessment of everything. And you realized how insecure some of their stuff was on premises. Well, they had a firewall, so that made things feel a little bit more secure. But then when they moved into the cloud, you had to help them transform what that looked like. So you've got a firewall that's sort of protecting everything, but you move into the cloud and you probably want to give your business units different environments to be able to spin things up pretty quickly. So you have to sort of figure out how you can translate what they're doing on premises into the cloud. And once you get past that first hurdle, which is usually the lift and shift or the direct migration path, once you get past that point, it's a little easier for them to realize the value of cloud, realize the value of security, and that leaning on the native tooling becomes a really important part.
Yeah, I know. We are now trying to talk hybrid because we don't want to share all the data. Like,
right.
There is always that one misunderstanding, like, my data is not secure on cloud. I'm like, there are some institutions who even enter into those institutions where they have the authority to see what's there inside that entire infrastructure. But a cloud vendor doesn't have that. There's always that misunderstanding that goes behind when we are architecting something using cloud. Like there'll be a guy in the room who says that Kubernetes has all the namespaces, all the operators, and he's so irritating in that meeting. Like he says Kubernetes, Kubernetes, Kubernetes. So it's always there. So now we are moving more towards the hybrid cloud. That's your favorite topic, which is VMware and all these things. Like you worked in VMware for a very long time. I know that because 2006 to 2015, then later on you just transition around VMware solutions here and there.
Correct.
But like, how is it all about when we are talking about a data hungry world today? Like we want all the data to be more secure. We want them monetize on the data. We want to make sure that all the data that we are collecting stays in the cloud, but there is a limitation to it as well. So how is world approaching in this data hungry world in betting on the hybrid cloud? Like what is it all about when they bet on the hybrid cloud today?
Sure. So I feel like when I talked to customers and I was customer facing the first 2 years I was at Microsoft, everybody's at a different point in their evolution, right? There's some firms who have been dark to cloud. There's some firms who have been toying around with Office 365. And there are some firms that have gotten, the authority from up above to say, move everything into the cloud. And people fall in different realms inside of those three kind of major areas. And as a result, now I always say this, I used to call it technical debt until my former boss said, these firms don't believe it's debt. They believe it's technical excellence because nobody's come in and told them that, having these mounds and mounds and mounds of things is not necessarily a good thing because it hinders future development or fast agile development. It hinders their ability to transform the business. And so if you think about it, because there's so many different customers that are out there and they're at so many different realms of trying to figure out how can we get ourselves into the cloud, you need to have some sort of hybrid cloud model or hybrid cloud approach. And at Microsoft, it's interesting, right? We have Azure Arc, and Azure Arc, at first I was thinking this is the weirdest product. And then I started playing around with it and I installed it in my home lab and I was like, no, actually, this is pretty amazing, because then you have your single pane of glass being Azure, and you can treat your VMs on premises as you do your VMs in Azure. So it's an interesting gap to sort of bridge in the sense that, you manage your VMs in a specific way in the cloud, right? You've got a specific way of spinning up environments, of lifecycle managing your environment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You didn't really have that on premises, but now you do with Azure Arc. So it's an interesting blend to be able to take environments, and they don't have to be on premises. They could be in AWS, they could be in GCP, right? It's really interesting the way that the Azure Arc product has come in and helped out that hybrid story. And then you have things like Azure VMware Solution, which I spent a lot of time focusing on the last almost 2 years. And the idea that, you're able to build out a software-defined data center and you're able to sort of bring what you're doing on premises into Azure, and you don't have to embrace all of the tools, all of the vernacular, everything out the gate. You get a chance to pick apart Azure at a time that makes the most sense to you. So you don't have to drink from the fire hose of Azure, right? Azure changes all the time. I mean, I used to joke when I was working with customers, it changed what felt like daily some days. Like one day a specific service would be reaching GA, and then the next day, like there would be another service that would be hitting public preview, and you're like, it's so hard to keep up. I don't even know what I'm supposed to tell this customer, but the idea of hybrid cloud is you get a chance to sort of take on a cloud provider at a pace that makes sense for your company. You don't have to just drink from the fire hose of Azure, so to speak, right? And I keep saying Azure because I'm mostly familiar with Azure, but I have worked with a lot of customers that have multi-cloud propositions, right? They're focused on multiple spots to land their workloads in the cloud. And the idea is, trying to meet the customer where they are versus forcing them to realize that, because the cloud's not going to go anywhere, right? So if you have this forcing function and you make all of these firms embrace infrastructure as a service, but they're not really ready for it, or they're not really ready to move everything right away, you probably need some sort of interim steps to get them more comfortable with what cloud looks like, right? So it's interesting. And I often feel like hybrid cloud is more of the story of meeting a customer where they are and trying to get them to realize the value of cloud over time. And I feel like what that does versus kind of forcing them to go into cloud, they sort of realize it on their own, and they start putting more and more, and they experiment more. And I think that's the hard thing, because, oftentimes as an operations person, we never had infinite amount of compute, networking, and storage, right? So we had a finite amount of resources, and we couldn't imagine spinning up multiple environments sometimes because you just didn't have the space or the environments or the area to do it. Well, now you get to kind of teach them that, okay, you can sort of experiment. You don't have to dive into the deep end. You could kind of dip your toe in and get familiar with the cloud. And these are some of the tools and ways in which you can do it. So it's interesting to kind of get these customers excited to embrace what cloud looks like. And then over time, you see them transform quickly, or more quickly, I should say. So it's an interesting realm. And I feel like, hybrid cloud's here to stay. Maybe it'll go away at some point, but like I said earlier, I almost feel like we're always going to have VMs somewhere, and they might be on premises, they might be in Azure, they might be in a different cloud, right? So I feel like it's an evolution, and that's kind of where hybrid cloud becomes an interesting point.
Back at that time when you told about VMs and Arc and everything, when we deploy something as in Databricks, there is always a NIC which is being allocated. There is a VNet which is always being allocated. There's a VM which comes in. We can't say VMs are absolute because they are defining what the components has to be in the cloud. Like they have their own. Like you can say a VM is a part of your data center. Like you can scale it. It's software defined. Like you can, like today we can say software has really defined the functionality of we accessing the data center, we controlling the network, we actually making the hardware more efficient. Like CUDA is there, which is more towards the hardware acceleration and things like that. Hardware accelerators are some sort of a misconception today. Like everybody wants to talk about hardware accelerators, like a deep learning researcher wants to talk about hardware accelerators and so on. So now there is a dilemma in what we are seeing about the infrastructure that we are building. Like, what is it all about when we are procuring a requirement, when we are architecting something using cloud? Like,
yeah, so I guess it depends upon what you're deploying, right?
one second. Sorry, I didn't complete the question. Sorry.
Oh, no worries.
Like, I wanted to know, like, is there any metrics to really measure the reliability of the infrastructure that we are deploying on? Or else, what is it all about when we are talking about this metric says that this is more effective in the cloud deployment today?
Sure. So there are tools you can deploy on premises, right? And I think that's the thing to hit home. It doesn't have to be a Microsoft specific product. There are a bunch of third-party software tools that do the same thing. A lot of times customers don't even know what they have. They've allowed their business units to be able to go spin up VMs to support the middleware tiers of their infrastructure. And they don't even know what those environments contain. They just know that because of all of the automation and the policies, those environments are being backed up, replicated, et cetera, but they don't know what they have. And so you probably want to go through some sort of assessment before you move everything into the cloud. I like talking about Azure Migrate quite a bit because Azure Migrate has evolved. It's not just your straight infrastructure, right? If you were looking for like, that would give you your like for like. So if you wanted to take your VMs on premises and run them in Azure, great. There's going to be a tool for you. You can also use the same tool to have it run an Azure VMware solution, which is awesome because it's an interesting evolution within that tool. But it also can look at web apps. It can also look at Kubernetes environments on premises, as well as your data platforms on premises. Like, can that SQL server be placed on an Azure SQL server? That's kind of cool. As well as, I believe you can also do VDI environments. And I haven't done one. I just recently got wind of it because one of my former colleagues was telling me about how much it had evolved. And I'm like, dang, that's awesome. The fact that you don't have to be sort of caught unaware. Now, there are software tools that do the same thing as well, right? I always talk about the Microsoft native tools because those don't come with a crazy amount of cost. Sometimes the third-party tools do come with a cost, but they do the same thing. They'll show you that, this business unit, you didn't even know what they were doing. They've got 15 to 20 servers. Of those 20 servers, only about 5 are mission critical. The rest you could potentially scrap, right? Those types of things are hard to find. And so you kind of need some sort of assessment tool to go in and take a look at your entire environment, right? So I always talk about it's look before you leap, right? That's that kind of that old cliche. You want to make sure you know what you have before you make that move into the cloud. And what you probably want to do is run those assessments over a course of maybe 30 days, maybe even 60 days. If you could run it for 90 days, that'll give you even more data to figure out, should we size up that VM? Should we even place this on a VM? Should we even move this environment, right? So I think, those types of tools help you out in terms of trying to figure out what you should move and when.
Yeah, when we talk about scaling platforms today, like let it be Kubernetes or something, like we have some sort of set of software which is already defining the way in which we are defining the scalability of it. Like there is always that metrics like, okay, how many servers how much was the hit that this server received? And there's always that one cliche understanding like, we have a private cloud, which is much more easier to be procured at once, but it's very difficult to keep updating all the things. So there is always a cloud. So today we are seeing that software is defining an architecture. Software is defining the way in which these scaling platforms need to be working. Like in one of your talks, not a talk, I think it was a short bit in Microsoft, you told it's Hazu Storage, the unsung hero. And you told that, a customer went down from paying $150,000 a year to about $2,000.
Yeah, it was about $2,000. Yeah, and I won't name the vendor, but they were thinking that cloud was expensive, and it was because they had spun up all of their environments in AWS on I think it's the EC2 instances. Those are all the servers, I believe. And if I have that wrong, please be kind. I'm never in AWS very often, but they had always had this idea that cloud was expensive, and we were looking at opportunities to kind of show them that we could augment what they were doing in Azure. They could be multi-cloud, and that Azure wasn't going to be just another cost. And so we took out a patch management solution for them, and we had them then lean on Azure Update Management. And we built out some custom workflows with PowerShell, Azure Automation, and some of the Kusto queries. But that team, it was like a huge aha moment where they realized if they just spent some time working with Microsoft would help them and prep them. And as a result, when we showed them that cloud wasn't just a massive cost, they were able to start embracing more and taking on more, because all of a sudden they weren't paying the vendor all that money. They were now able to free themselves up from that arrangement, and they could focus on putting that money elsewhere. And so I know that last I had heard, they were experimenting more with what they could do to sort of augment what they're already doing in AWS and on premises. So they're thinking of it. It's weird. It's kind of like a colo, but also kind of like another spot to spin up environments and to have workloads. And the interesting part too was, if I remember correctly, their AWS servers didn't have a lot of patch management kind of built, right? So those servers were sitting out there as a security vulnerability, and they were able to lean on Azure Update Management to help. And so I always like that story, because I think there's so many more of those stories that are out there, meaning you have your predominant workloads in AWS or your predominant workloads in Azure, and you can figure out a way to sort of balance between the two, and or even Google for that matter. I know Google is always kind of that up and comer, but I know that they're getting a lot more folks interested in what they're doing. And then you get a chance to sort of spread your environments over multiple clouds. That way you're not kind of putting everything in one spot. So, but yeah, it's interesting to help customers realize the value of cloud and sort of transform their opinions.
Yeah, that's the impact of developer advocacy relations, and also how you deal with the program team inside the company and outside with the customers,
Sure.
right? It's all about that. I feel that, scaling platforms today, we are just playing with some sort of a trade-off. Like, we know that somewhere it's going to break, but like how? We now have a trade-off there as well. So now we know that we are supposed to be playing with the trade-offs, but there is always the documentation which is already being there.
Right.
And you advocate more about it today. And I wanted to know what should be the effort that we need to be putting in order to build and define the culture of DevOps
Sure.
in the institution, as well as defining the security and the compliance, reliability, everything which defines the software and the hardware architecture that we are moving towards. What is it all about when we are architecting something as a solution today?
So there was a customer I worked with prior to Microsoft, and they were an interesting customer, enterprise grade, number of employees. I think they were like somewhere in around like 5,000 employees, right? So big, and they had offices all over, and they had to figure out a way to sort of speed up their transition. Now, they did what a lot of DevOps folks would probably sort of cringe about. They created a DevOps team. And the reason that DevOps folks will cringe about that is because you shouldn't have to do that, but this firm did. And if you follow the trajectory of what they did, I were able to finally dissolve the DevOps teams and put those people back into specific business units, but they needed to bring dedicated folks from different parts of the org. So security, identity, infrastructure, some of the middleware tiers that they were focused on, right? So they needed to bring people in all these different realms, and they made up the DevOps team. And they sort of defined the patterns for cloud adoption. They defined the patterns for moving things into cloud. And then fast forward a year or two later, they were able to sort of dissolve the DevOps team and kind of move the folks into different business units. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting evolution. Now, granted, that doesn't always happen, right? I think the hardest thing about DevOps is the process and the people. It's not the technology, which people would tell you, no, the technology is hard. I'm like, it depends. It's all teachable. And if you're interested in learning about it, you'll pick it up. But it's the people in the process that's a lot harder, because we've lived in this realm of, I called it earlier waterfall, right? So everybody's got to get into a room, they've got to reach the right conclusion together. Whereas DevOps is sort of more agile. You break apart these longer processes, you have smaller teams to get things across the finish line faster, and it can be done. It's just not an easy process. So when I worked with that customer, one of the big points was to read the DevOps handbook. And oh my gosh, I'm blanking on, there's an actual fiction novel that was based off of it as well. Why can the Phoenix
Project.
Yeah. Thank you. So they had to read the DevOps handbook and the Phoenix Project. And I'm like, wow, the caffeine kind of kicked in right at this, like right as you kind of helped me out here. So, but yes, they had to kind of read both of those books. And that group was the group that I worked predominantly with. However, I was working with other parts of the business too to help that team sort of handle what they needed to do. But I think that's the hardest part, right? Change is not fun, especially if somebody has been like, so for instance, at this firm, there were people that had been doing the same role for 30 years and they're close to retirement. They don't want to learn anything new and they're more grumpy, right? And it's not a bad thing. It's just, I think to myself, if I was their age and I was told now we're going to move everything in the cloud, you got to learn all this new stuff, I'd be like, oh, really? Do I have to? so I feel like it's one of those things where it's not an overnight sensation. It takes some time to get folks familiar with DevOps, but and then it's kind of having those champions. So the group that would form that DevOps team, they were sort of instrumental in getting the folks that were more like, I don't want to learn something new, to learn new things. And it was an interesting transformation to kind of watch. And it was weird because I wasn't like I was like watching kind of a family kind of realize they had to evolve is what it felt like, because all those people had worked together for years and years and years and years and years. And I'm a consultant being brought in, and I kind of feel like I'm like the neighbor coming over and hanging out for a bit, right? So it was a great transformation to watch, and I feel like more and more customers could probably do something similar. The problem becomes the idea that you could potentially make a mistake, right? And I think that's where traditionally, if you make a mistake in IT, usually it's something where it's a resume generating event, right? You get fired, right? like you didn't plan to accidentally take down Exchange, right? In years prior, when people would host Exchange on premises, you didn't plan to take something down and you accidentally did. Whereas in a DevOps world, you want to fail and you want to fail fast. And so, you want to break apart these big teams and you want to give them an opportunity to sort of build a playground and kind of learn and experiment and what makes sense. And right. And so I think that's the hard thing, but I know every customer could probably get there because all of it sounds great. Like I remember when I read the Phoenix Project, I was like, why would nobody like why wouldn't you do something like this? Because I think we've all worked in those environments where people have just done something for years and years and years and they haven't really thought about changing things around. So yeah, so I feel like the harder parts are the people in the process versus the technology, because the technology, you could fit any tool in there and have it do whatever it needed to do. And if you had to learn it, no problem, you'll get a chance to learn it. But the harder part is sort of breaking the mold of what he'd been doing previously. But I do say there are a lot more folks who are seeing the value of DevOps, who are hearing these stories and they're realizing, gosh, we have to change because our competitors are already changing. And if we want to stay competitive, we want to still have a spot in this landscape of all of these different companies that are competing for the same thing, revenue, right? We want to make sure that we can evolve and transform what we're doing. So but I feel like we're still not done, right? DevOps is still going to be around. I'll even say some of the DevOps folks I've worked with will tell you that it's evolved as now site reliability engineering. So I suspect it'll continue to evolve. I think DevOps is too much of a buzzword for some of those folks. And that's why they're like, oh no, it's site reliability engineering. And I'm like, okay, well, whatever it is, it's a good thing to have. And what's interesting is it's always been like pioneered by people that were more interested in sort of making that change. And then what it takes folks being able to talk to other folks that might be not necessarily super thrilled with change and getting them to buy into it. And a lot of that's listening, a lot of that's empathizing, and a lot of that's kind of then showing them how you can kind of take what you had thought was true about cloud and kind of helping them evolve and realize that, they probably should change their mind a little bit about it.
That's true. That's true. Because like sometimes I feel like, in the same talk, the Azure story is the unsung hero. You also emphasized on how less you wrote as a code and how much more of an influence that is made on that firm itself.
Right.
Like that was the influence of code that we are just now trying to build. Like we are now trying to go low code, no code to some extent. Like we are now trying to build a lot of plug and play stuff and things like that. So now I know that you have witnessed a lot of chaos in a lot of institutions, like other companies, and also you of course, every person who talks DevOps or else who said dev for a day should have had faced chaos in his entire life. So
right.
What should be the learning that an IT culture need to learn from chaos? Like every chaos has its own story. It's not about Jenkins going slow at one point. It's all about like, how are you making it more secure, reliable, and how is your metrics is coming out way in your hand? Like we talk too much of software today, but these softwares are somewhat vulnerable, because I feel that because more of the, like earlier when you asked the DevOps guys who used to do DevOps, 20, 30 years before, they used to say that, I used to take a CD, boot it up, spin it on a server. That was what I did as DevOps.
Right.
So what should be the perception towards the chaos that we are facing today? It can be a production issue. It can be anything.
Sure.
So what should we be learning? Should we be learning when we see a chaos in any of the environment that we are talking about?
I was going to say yes. I think so. There's this whole realm now that's becoming a big focus point. It's called chaos engineering. It's the idea that you need to plan for the worst case scenario and you need to be able to test around it and make sure that your environment doesn't go down, right? And so chaos engineering is interesting, right? So I wanted to bring that up. I actually have a former colleague of mine that's focusing on it very heavily right now. And at some point I've got to connect up with her and figure out what she's learned thus far. But it's an interesting realm, right? On top of the fact that chaos isn't necessarily a bad thing, I feel like the shift in perception should be, we now have cloud. So the finite capabilities we were used to previously, meaning we had only a certain amount of compute, networking, and storage, we now have to think about the fact that we have an opportunity to scale up and scale down. And we have an opportunity to sort of build things with resilience in mind. And we have an opportunity to test things. So I used to work at firms where we didn't have an environment to do a lot of testing. So we did a lot of stupid stuff during change windows and hope for the best, right? Because we didn't have an environment to go to. Would this work? We had no idea. And so now that you've got these different realms in cloud, you've got this opportunity to have multiple environments, you can start to break apart that chaos and make it be more manageable, right? Because there's no bad day like a storage bad day, right? There's no bad day like a network bad day, right? Those are pretty awful days. It doesn't matter what type of platform you're on, you could still be on premises and networking screws up and nothing happens, right? Storage screws up and nothing happens, right? In the realm of cloud, some of the same tenants are there. So you have to figure out how to architect around it and, and to always be, I guess, thinking about evolution. So I joke a lot that Microsoft is in the same pattern, right? I think of Microsoft as agile in real life. That's why you see these products and mature in interesting ways. As soon as it becomes sort of GA, follow it over the course of a year or two and see how much it changes from the GA date to 2 to 3 years in the future, right? So we are evolving, we are iterative. You shouldn't necessarily have to wait for everything to be perfect in order to take on the cloud. I had a customer that said, well, we're going to wait until X, Y, and Z is done. And I'm like, these are, I think, on the back burner of our engineering teams. Like, I don't even anticipate you moving to cloud until like 3 years from now. And think about how cloud changes. So 3 years from now, when everything's perfect for their on-premises realm, they're going to miss out on so much of the other new services. And so I think it's just the idea of to think about IT as more iterative, try, fail, experiment. Don't freak out about chaos. Try to mitigate an actual outage, right, as best as possible. But if you are familiar with chaos engineering, it's the whole idea of you sort of bring about all of the chaos and you create faults, right, to simulate what would actually happen if there was a regional issue with a cloud provider. Like, could we still have this web app be accessible? Could we still have this environment be up and functional? Could people still log in? Could we fail everything over to a different region, right? So those are some of the things to think about if you move into cloud, but that chaos engineering can still be brought to on-premises too, so long as you have multiple environments. Because if you leave everything in one specific environment, that's sort of a single point of failure. You want to have multiple environments if you're going to stay on premises, and it gets a little trickier, but it's still doable. And I think, if you aren't yet ready to move to cloud, you still could embrace some of these DevOps methodologies and make your on-premises environment even better too. So, but yeah, so I think it's just the idea of chaos isn't necessarily a bad thing. You want to mitigate a potential outage. You want to think through the worst case scenario and sort of architect around it. And then you want to be able to adapt and evolve as time moves forward, because of the fact that it's going to always evolve in general in terms of whatever cloud provider you choose. So you have to think about it as like an iterative evolution. That's probably the best way to describe it.
Today we have governance as code, policy as code. This is the last question because I've asked everything that I want to ask related to DevOps. So now let's just shift to the shift left that we are just looking forward to. Like we had infrastructure as code, which rocked the world for a very long time till now. But like now we are coming up with governance as code, policy as code.
Yes.
And we still haven't defined the real IT transformation in a company. Like we always say that stop your IT transformation somehow. Like talk less of your IT stuff, start deploying stuff and seeing what the chaos means to you today.
Yeah.
So it's always that talk that is going in the market today, but we still have figured out a lot of ways like governance as code and policy as code. So now we are talking about high availability and less chaos that we are defining for the future world. So now what is the influence of all these tech that we are building today, the governance and the policy as code? How is it going to define DevSecOps for the tomorrow's world?
Well, so I think the reason why we had to think this through is because all of a sudden developers and infrastructure folks had all of this access to cloud, and all of a sudden they were making a really expensive cloud bill, right? And so we wanted to think about ways in which to reduce cost, because you're always going to have to pay if you're moving something out of your own. I mean, you're paying on premises, but it's different. It's more of like a sunk cost, meaning you pay at one time and then it depreciates over time. But cloud is more of that OpEx model. And so you have to be comfortable with the fact that, you've got to have a plan in place. Like, I don't want to go over 10,000 a month or something. I'm just throwing that out there, right? Guardrails aren't necessarily a bad thing. They just, they provide ways in which for you to ensure your environment's secure, that the naming standards, so nobody's, spinning up a server with test 001 and all of a sudden it's in production, because that was also a thing that happened. Environments would get spun up and everybody kind of install whatever needed to be installed on that one server, and it would literally have the name test 001 on it. And you're like, well, okay, but this is like supporting a massive business function. We probably should have thought about naming standards, right? And then, regional awareness. You don't want to have somebody go and deploy something in Europe and they're an American customer, right? Because they're going to have all kinds of weird latencies. So I think the idea of putting those guardrails in place was sort of a direct result of giving folks access to the cloud and them just experimenting and putting things all over and creating really expensive bills, right? So I like the idea you can put it all into code now too. I feel like that's more, not necessarily, well, maybe resilient is a good thing, right? Because of the fact that you're committing that code into a source control tool. It doesn't have to be GitHub, doesn't have to be Azure DevOps, but it could be. Those are the two I'm most familiar with. And then you've got that environment and you can redeploy it. Because I mean, policy, it wouldn't be necessarily a VM. It would be something that lives outside of a VM that sort of, directs the flow of what you should be doing in terms of Azure, right? So but yeah, I feel like governance as code is an interesting realm, and we're going to see this space expand because, more and more customers have moved into this realm of, we should be moving into cloud. We should be trying to embrace what's new, but maybe they're still in the idea of they're lifting and shifting into an Azure VMware solution environment. They're going to be picking apart Azure services over time. And so I feel like they're going to bring about new ways of thinking through Azure policy or any sort of policies, right, that we haven't yet thought through. And I feel like the big interesting thing is to realize that we're going through another evolution. Like, I read a news article, I want to say it was like 5 or 6 years ago, that was talking about the waves of cloud adoption. I think we're past that first wave. We're sort of in the second wave, right? So all of the pioneers have done all of the, the trailblazing, so to speak. They've learned all of the pieces of what to pay attention to, how to build things with resiliency, how to build things with high availability, with DevOps, fast, quick, sprints, trying to get things up and functional. And then I think we're kind of in that interesting second evolution where some of these firms that are still very large are like, well, wow, these huge companies have moved. Maybe we should start moving iteratively. And so, this analyst had said he believes there's going to be, I think, like 3 evolutions of cloud. Who knows if there will be, because some people would argue that we're still kind of in that first wave too, because we still have folks that are like, oh, we need to move everything into Azure, but we don't want to move it into an Azure IaaS environment. We want to move it to Azure VMware solution, right? So again, I guess it goes back to this whole notion of every customer's at a different point in their evolution, and the idea that governance as code has evolved. Like, I remember when I first picked up Azure policy, that was probably what, 3-4 years ago, maybe closer to 5. It was always kind of an awkward thing. Like, it wasn't as put together as it is now, right? So there's a GitHub repo. There's a lot of examples that are out there. Folks blog about it. MVPs blog about it. Microsoft talks about it, right? So there's a lot of examples that are out there. And I think that sort of helped the evolution. Whereas back when it first was announced, it was kind of like, well, I get what this is trying to do, but I can't think of all of the scenarios by myself. Well, it took that evolution for us to kind of realize, oh, we should probably make sure that, VMs are spun up in a specific region, or VMs are spun up in a specific naming convention, right? They have a specific amount of tags. And so you can start to help the folks that are spinning up environments have it maintain a certain baseline that you're hoping for. So it's interesting to kind of see the evolution over time with customers evolving and picking up governance as code and all of the above. So it gets really fascinating to sort of watch it And I wonder where we're going to be the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, like, are we just going to think about cloud and you have an environment spin up? I don't know. I don't know. Right. We're going to have to see.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. We are just moving so agile that it's very difficult to just keep track of all the things. And
Right.
thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much for such
Of
great
course.
insights. It was an honor doing a podcast with you, and thank you so much for being on my podcast
Well, thanks
and
for the
sharing such
opportunity.
great insights.
Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.